Okay, while folks keep coming in, I just wanted to welcome everyone to AGU EPSP Connects first spring 2023 webinar. We have a monthly webinar series. I'm Risa Madoff, and I will be co-hosting with Michelle Melendez. And Roberto Fernandez is handling Zoom. He's the Zoom manager today. And so thank everyone for coming. Before I introduce the speaker, I just want to let you know to put your questions in the chat. You can do that really at any time, but we'll be handling questions at the after Dr. Tooth's talk. And then we'll be reading them in the chat, or alternately, we may call on you to unmute and ask the question yourself. Okay, so I'm happy to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Stephen Tooth. He's currently chair of the Department of Geography and Earth Sciences at Aberystwyth University in Wales. Just for some background, he completed his PhD at the University of Wollongong in Australia, and did postdoctoral work at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, before coming to the current department in 2000. He's currently affiliated with an international group that studies wetlands and drylands, which is what today's talk is about. And that includes researchers from South Africa and Australia. His research interests include fluvial geomorphology and the geomorphology of sedimentology in drylands, with particular emphasis in regions of Australia and South Africa. And so the title of this talk today is The Geomorphology of Wetlands in Drylands, Hither Science, Management in an Anthropocene. Okay, so I'll let Dr. Tooth take it away. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you for the invite to present to you all today. It's nice to see a mix of people from all around the world logging on. I was looking at the participants list a little bit earlier, and I recognized some familiar names there, as well as some names that I'm not so familiar with. Anyway, it's a great honor and privilege to be invited to give one of the EPSP Connects virtual talks, but also slightly daunting, especially as I'm the first talk of the year, because if I mess up, it possibly sets a bad tone for the series. I hope that's not going to be the case, obviously. It's also an interesting challenge to be talking to you from my rather untidy office rather than standing in front of you all and trying to engage you that way. But I guess we've all got used to this sort of form of presentation over the last few years, and virtual talks like this can bring together a global community of researchers in a way that was unthinkable even a few years ago. Anyway, it is what it is, and I hope what I say will prove to be informative and thought-provoking. If the possibility exists, it'd be good for you to type your questions and comments into the Q&A box, as has just been suggested, but also just briefly who you are and where you're based. As I said, I recognise some names, but not all. It'd be nice for me to know just briefly how much you know about wetlands in general. Very little, a moderate amount, a lot. How much you know about wetland geomorphology? Very little, a moderate amount, or a lot. And particularly if you know what Ramsar refers to. If you do know what Ramsar refers to, when was the last World Wetlands Day and what was its theme? The relevance of me asking this question to you will become more obvious as I go through. Okay, so to the title, Wetlands in Drylands in an Anthropocene, Wither, Science and Management. Wither. So this is an archaic word used in the sense of to what place, to where, or to what endpoint. It's a deliberately open question to which I'm not going to provide a concrete or definitive answer. I'm not going to lay out a roadmap and suggest that we all follow it. That would be arrogant in the extreme and not at all in the spirit of what I'm assuming these EPSP Connects talks are for. Rather, I assume they're more for open discussion and debate and sharing of findings and ideas. But as I go through, I will pose a series of subsidiary questions. These are things my human geography and social science colleagues would call provocations, if you like. These are subsidiary questions that we all need to contemplate collectively amongst ourselves and with others if our wetland science and management is not to wither as in the WITHER spelling of the word. In other words, if we want our science and management to retain vitality, force, and freshness so that it continues to be of benefit and value for society. So essentially, there are three parts to the talk. I'm going to firstly consider the implications of a putative Anthropocene time interval for wetland science and management. I am going to assume that many of you know about the term Anthropocene, but just in case there are some of you that don't or haven't yet contemplated its ramifications for wetlands in particular, I will briefly outline some of its implications. Then I'll go on to assess the current state of science and management in the world's wetlands and drylands. This is drawing on around 25 years of experience working across a number of drylands globally, many of which are various types of wetlands embedded within. These regions include parts of South Africa and Botswana, Australia, parts of South America and Southern Europe. But that doesn't matter greatly, as much of what I will say is not necessarily specific to wetlands in drylands. It could well apply to wetlands more generally. So if you're familiar with wetlands from other parts of the world, that's okay. And the third part of the talk, I will outline key challenges for the science and management of wetlands in drylands. This is where a number of my provocations will be introduced, but probably unusually for me, I'm going to try and end on a positive note. Right, before we get into the main parts of the talk, I just want to start with some basic definitions for those of you that haven't thought too much about wetlands or indeed drylands. So, what is a wetland? Okay, so they can be defined in various ways, but the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, which is the only international convention dedicated to a specific ecosystem, it's now in its 52nd year, uses a very broad definition of wetlands. I'll come back to the Ramsar Convention at various points through this talk, but essentially one of the simplest definitions that comes from the Ramsar definition is here on the screen. So it's an area that is periodically or continuously inundated by shallow water or has saturated soils, and where plant growth and other biological activities are adapted to the wet conditions. So with that definition in mind, where are wetlands located globally? So here's a map. I don't know how well this is going to show for some of you, but it attempts to show the dryland regions of the world, shown with a stippling there. So the drylands are mainly in the continental interiors, say of North Africa and Southern Africa, parts of South America, the interior of North America, Asia, and Australia. And the major wetland regions with major wetlands and regions with abundant wetlands are shown in the darker shadings there. So if you look at this global distribution, you'll see most of the wetlands are in the high latitudes, mid and high latitudes of the Northern Hemisphere in particular, but there's also a belt of wetlands running through the tropics, through the Amazon basin, through tropical Africa and Southeast Asia. There are also some wetlands in the northern part of Australia and so on. Okay, now at this scale, there is relatively little obvious overlap between the area of major wetlands or the regions with abundant wetlands and the area of drylands. Now that's probably unsurprising, given that drylands by definition are characterized by overall surface water deficits. So drylands, you would think, are hardly conducive to the formation and maintenance of wetlands, or at least one would think. But global scale maps like this are inadequate for capturing many of the diverse types of wetlands and drylands that do actually exist. Now, these wetlands are known by a variety of weird and wonderful names, local and regional names, including billabongs, bofidales, bogs, boinkers, cienagas, floodplain wetlands, magines, marshes, oases, pans, pliers, and so on and so forth. Many of these wetlands in drylands, in fact, all of the larger ones really, are fed by rivers. Smaller ones can be fed by local rainfall and runoff and or by groundwater efflux. So even in the Atacama Desert, one of the driest places on Earth, where annual rainfall totals could be 0, and there's occasional rain, but it's very rare. You can still find small seepage wetlands in headwaters of some incised stream networks. These are fed by groundwater seepage. Now, some of these wetlands may be individually small, but collectively they may cover a significant area of the dryland. And they have all kinds of importance in ecosystem service delivery. They provide a range of provisioning, regulating, supporting, and cultural ecosystem services, and at various levels from local through regional to the global. And there's just some examples there for wetlands in general. Despite this, wetlands, and particularly wetlands and drylands, have been ignored by many geomorphologists, and any geomorphological contributions to wetland science have remained little recognised or underutilised by wetland ecologists and land managers. And I'll come back to some of those issues as we go through. Anyway, that's a bit of background for those of you unfamiliar with wetlands and drylands and Ramsar and so on. So let's get on to the main part of the talk. So we'll start with the implications of a putative Anthropocene time interval for wetland science and management. So hopefully for most of you, this is just going to be recap, but the Anthropocene is a proposed new geological time interval that accounts for human domination of Earth system functioning. According to some estimates, around 43% of the Earth's terrestrial surface is now subject to some form of agriculture. And we also have widespread damming of rivers, draining of wetlands, coastal protection works, beach replenishment, estuary dredging, forest clearance, or forest planting of non-native monocultures, species translocations, greenhouse gas emissions, and so on and so forth. The basic argument runs that these human activities, direct and indirect, deliberate and inadvertent, are now so widespread and so profound that they are overwhelming the great forces of nature. And they will have a discernible permanent impact on the Earth's sedimentary and fossil record. In essence, have we now exited the Holocene epoch, the latest interglacial time interval, and moved into a new interval of geological time, essentially a time interval of our own making, the Anthropocene? If so, when did the Anthropocene start? Does the Anthropocene sit on top of the Holocene? Or does it cut across the Holocene, perhaps removing the need for the Holocene entirely and extending some way back into the Pleistocene? Now, as most of you will be aware, of course, these issues are still contested in formal geological terms. There are many arguments both for and against the sedimentological and fossil reality of the Anthropocene. And even if you accept the concept in theory, there are many debates about when the start date of the Anthropocene should be. So the term has yet to be formally ratified, so perhaps at present should be really used with a lowercase a. But that's not a debate or set of debates really that I want to get into here. The key point for us really is that the widespread, pervasive nature of human impacts on Earth systems are now widely recognised. And the Anthropocene concept provides an increasingly prevalent framework for debate in wider academic, cultural and policy circles. Now, rivers and wetlands are some of the most impacted systems on the planet. I forget the exact figures, but the natural functions and ecological health of significantly more than half of the world's rivers has been seriously impacted by human activities, and there has been widespread loss of wetlands over recent centuries, particularly since 1900, with some estimates suggesting losses certainly upwards of 50% and possibly closer to 90% in places like Europe and North America. Now, we can trace a history of new terms to reflect this. So over 20 years ago, Ellen Wall was writing about virtual rivers, as defined on the screen there. We see Curtis Richardson referring to the Everglades as a managenous wetland, a totally managed system. John Lewin talks about genetically modified floodplains. Werther and colleagues talk about the fluvial anthroposphere. Certainly, the old conceptual view of wetlands needs revisiting. This is the classic diagram from Mitch and Gosselink's highly influential book on wetlands. This version, I think, is from, it's from the 3rd edition, but I think also appears in later editions. It's into its 5th or 6th edition now. Now, this diagram shows wetlands as the product of interactions between hydrology, biota, and physicochemistry, two-way interactions. This is a valuable perspective, of course, but one that's focused on short-term, small area interactions. From another perspective, my perspective specifically, this diagram is flawed in several ways. First, it relegates geomorphology and climate just to minor peripheral influences on the system. Then minor peripheral external influences acting on the core interactions. But of course, geomorphology is integral to wetland structure and function and change over various timescales. And also the distinctive climate of drylands, the highly variable rainfall, runoff and temperature variations give wetlands in these areas some of their distinctive characteristics, such as the tendency for long periods of desiccation and the associated ecological cycles of boom and bust. Also, people are totally absent from this diagram. Where are the influences of people on wetlands, and indeed the influence of wetlands on people? Where are the environmental policy making and management influences that act on many wetlands globally, including through international conventions like the Ramsar Convention? So I think we need a more encompassing view of wetlands where human agency plays a larger role, overlapping with geomorphology and climate to provide the boundary conditions within which wetland interactions between hydrology, biota, and physicochemistry play out. Perhaps something a little more like this Venn-style diagram, which was developed several years back by the Wetlands and Drylands Research Network, about which I shall say a little bit more later. It retains the essence of the Mitch and Gosselink diagram, but places more emphasis on those larger scale, longer acting sets of influences. We feel this view is much more closely aligned with themes coming from initiatives such as the Ramsar Convention that see most wetlands globally as working landscapes where water, life, and the wetlands are inseparable. I shall also say more about Ramsar activities towards the end, including this year's theme. So we need a new conceptual view of wetlands, but understanding the role of human agency also has practical implications. For instance, for river and wetland conservation, rehabilitation, and restoration. So for the case of rivers in the Colorado Front Range, Ellen Wohlers asked, what should these rivers look like? What should these rivers look like in the absence of human interventions? And we can really only attempt to answer this question if we know how the systems function prior to widespread human impacts. We can pose this question in all sorts of other river and wetland contexts, of course. But even if we try to right the wrongs of the past and attempt to restore rivers and wetlands to what we think they should look like, is it even possible? If humans are now so profound, if human impacts on rivers and wetlands are now so profound and boundary conditions have changed so radically, for instance, in terms of flow, sediment, input, nutrient fluxes and biota, is it really possible to put them back to what they should look like? Here's an example from the Kissimmee River in central Florida, if I've pronounced the name of that river correctly, where they have tried to restore a river which I think originally was sinuous, then it was straightened and effectively a canal was dug through the middle of the wetland. They've now plugged the wetland and tried to reinstall meanders. But is it desirable necessarily to put rivers and wetlands back to what they used to be like? Perhaps in some cases it is. But perhaps in other cases we should be manipulating, if you like, rivers and wetlands to maximize those ecosystem services deemed to be most important. And this might be flow regulation for water supply or water quality, environmental flow allocations for biodiversity, manipulating landforms and landscapes to maximize carbon capture and storage, or some combination of these services. Okay, so with that background in mind, let's move on to the second part of the talk, which is what is the current state of science and management in the world's wetlands and drylands? So in particular, in a putative Anthropocene, uppercase A if you prefer, or lowercase a if you prefer, does it now make sense to talk of natural wetlands free from human influences? Probably not, would be my answer there. It's more a case of a spectrum of wetlands, I think. Some relatively unimpacted, or appearing to be so at least. Some relatively unimpacted and having limited management, through to some that are highly impacted, or indeed totally artificial with very high degrees of management. So I'm just going to pick some examples from along this spectrum, then focus in on one particular case study. So if we look around the world, we can certainly find areas of relatively pristine wetland. So we'll zoom in here to the wetlands around the Chobe River and Zambezi River confluence in the Four Corners region of central southern Africa. So it's basically where Botswana, Namibia, Zimbabwe and Zambia meet. And you can see there's the Chobe River coming in from the left towards the right. So basically west to east, and the Zambezi coming down from the north, and they meet in this confluence zone. There are lots of secondary channels in a complex assemblage. Now, the physical structure of these wetlands is down to a complex interplay of tectonic activity and climate changes. And there is no significant human impact in this particular region. The feeder rivers that I've just highlighted, the inflowing rivers there, are still largely unaffected by large dams, large-scale flow abstraction, or significant channel engineering. And so the flood dynamics and channel floodplain morphologies remain close to their natural state. Now, there are some creeping changes in the region. If we go a little bit farther to the southwest into the Okavango Delta region and the Kwando system, there have been some ill-fated management attempts, dredging parts of the system in an attempt to improve drainage, attempts to halt avulsions that are taking place. There's been some local degradation, but not really major human impacts at system scale. So certainly out of all the large wetlands and drylands worldwide, these are relatively natural and relatively free from significant human influences. But let's jump to the other extreme, where we have engineered, artificial, highly managed wetlands. So top left there, we have La Laguna de Sariñena in Spain, which was originally a dry salt pan, but is now permanently inundated, effectively a shallow lake. It's surrounded by irrigation agriculture, as you can see on the right of the slide there. And water levels are essentially controlled by return irrigation flows. And they're controlled, the water levels are controlled for the benefit of bird life. In this particular setting, it's bitterns that nest in the reeds. So essentially, we have a permanent shallow lake maintained in an arid area where historically only salt pans have existed. And it's now a Natura 2000 site and used for ecotourism. Another example on the bottom of the slide there are artificial wetlands along Las Vegas Wash in Nevada. Las Vegas, as most of you will be aware, of course, is one of the USA's fastest growing cities. And wastewater from hotels and urban runoff led to a series of catastrophic flash floods in the 1980s and 1990s that enlarged the wash. If you actually look carefully on that picture on the lower right, you can see the strip in the background there. One of these catastrophically widened and deepened channels is shown on the lower left. Anyway, the Las Vegas Wash was enlarged by these flash floods, and the sediment that was liberated was impacting on a downstream marina on Lake Mead. So there was a series of attempts to construct wetlands in this setting, primarily for flood control, as far as I understand it. But there were fringe benefits for wildlife and recreation, and the area is now a nature preserve. So those are the two ends of the spectrum, but in the middle, we have these sort of messy mid-spectrum rivers, if you like, that have varying degrees of human impact. Some of these may appear to be pristine or near pristine. In some cases, they are Ramsar listed, such as the Macquarie Marshes in Australia, as shown here. Now, the Macquarie marshes are fed by the lower Macquarie River, and the marshes have been undergoing shrinkage and contraction as a result of a complex combination of longer-term climate change, flow abstraction, and agricultural encroachment. If you look on the left of the false color LiDAR image there, you can see agricultural fields abutting this paleo channel of the Macquarie River. That is a paleo channel of the Macquarie River. It used to be possibly a perennial and certainly a through-going river to regional base level. But now this is the modern Macquarie River, which is a discontinuous system that breaks down into floodouts. Some of the flow regathers into these small channels, but it doesn't persist all the way through to regional base level. And in fact, these changes within the marshes have been so profound that the Ramsar status of the marshes has been threatened. There was a proposal to possibly delist it a few years back, unless management practices and policies were improved. Okay, let's also go to the Klip River in South Africa, which provides a particularly insightful case, I think, as I shall explain. So this is a system that colleagues and myself worked on quite a lot in the late 1990s and the first decade of the new millennium. And we used OSL dating to establish the history of channel change in these wetlands. The Klip River is a tributary of the Vaal River, which is the second largest river in South Africa. It flows from the south towards the north. The blue line here is the active channel at present, and the grey lines are paleo channels, which we OSL dated, and we worked out the age of abandonment of these paleo channels going back to about 30,000 years or so. Essentially, we established an avulsion history for this wetland. Avulsions here take place through abandonment of old sections of channel and simultaneous concomitant formation of new sections of channel. We also worked out the lateral migration rates of individual bends. So here's one example from Caddy's Drift towards the lower end of the Klip River wetland, where we OSL dated scroll bars on the inside of this meander bend. We knew the cutoff date of this bend from the aerial photograph record. It occurred sometime between 1954 and 1979. And the OSL ages in years before present are shown here on the transect. So basically the bend started growing outwards about 1,000 years ago, through to a couple of hundred years ago, and then was cut off, like I say, between 54 and 79, and the infill for the bend confirmed that. We were able to work out the average migration rate of this particular bend, 0.16 meters per year. So in global terms, a pretty slow migration rate. So in the Klip River system, we have infrequent avulsions. One avulsion occurs about once every 3,000 to 6,000 years in this system, and we have very slow lateral migration rates. So effectively, in this system, going back to at least 30,000 years, we have long-term morphological stability under natural conditions. Essentially, we have a meandering system with periodic avulsions persisting over that entire 30,000 year period with no obvious change in size or shape of the channel. Now, when I say natural conditions, that's prior to significant human settlement in the valley, and that all changes in the colonial period, which in this part of the world was from about the late 1800s onwards. So colonial settlers moved into the valley, and a number of things take place. There's widespread changes to biota. A lot of the native biota, including hippos, which frequented these wetlands, were shot and removed, and cattle cattle were introduced. The other thing they did was dig trenches through the wetlands, presumably to improve drainage and improve the pasture for cattle grazing. So, as I said, the Klip River flows from south towards the north here, and the circle here shows the view more or less that's in here. But we're looking in this picture, we're looking from north towards the south. So, in a sense, we're looking up valley along that, what I've called here a trench, which was effectively dug across the wetland. The old Clip River channel used to come down here. It's now essentially failed, as I shall talk about in a second. And here's a picture of the failing channel, or nowadays it's failed really. But the main thing that this trench did was kickstart a series of head cuts, which worked their way up valley. There's a smaller head cut here, but the main one here, we think the trench was dug sometime in the 1930s, possibly prior. We haven't really been able to pin that down, but certainly in about 1930, the head cut was there. By 1954, it had migrated upstream to reach there. By 1979, it was all the way up here. By 2002, when we first started doing our work there, it was into the area shown by the blue box. And effectively now the head cut has connected through to the main Clip River up valley, and the avulsion is practically complete. The consequences of this have been quite profound in the wetlands. So the main channel, the old Clip River, decreased in size downstream and infilled. The head cut conversely grows in size downstream, and where it joins the main Clip River, there is now dramatic enlargement of the Clip River channel. It had basically incised, in fact, so much so that the groundwater levels had been drawn down, threatening the wetland status on the surrounding terrain. So in an attempt to raise groundwater levels and keep the wetlands flooded on a seasonal basis, they installed a whole series of weirs along the enlarged Clip River channel, which worked to some degree, but set in train a whole series of other problems, as illustrated here. So here's an example of one of the weirs, which during flood flows, yes, flow disperses laterally out onto the floodplain, but some of it goes around the side of the weir, over the steepened channel banks, and cascades down into the incised channel, kick-starting off other head cuts. So to solve that problem, they constructed these concrete bunds, pretty much in this location here. They ran several hundred meters out onto the floodplain to deflect the flow all the way out onto the floodplain and try and prevent this problem of head cut erosion on the downstream side of the weirs occurring. Now, bear in mind that this is a Ramsar listed wetland, and there's this whole series of interventions have taken place here. You know, wetlands are a bit like a Pandora's box, really. Once you sort of lift the lid and things start to happen, and you're always chasing your tail, and you can never quite put them back to how they were. Anyway, the upshot of all of this is that avulsions have been a natural feature of this wetland, as I demonstrated, for at least the last 30,000 years. But after colonial settlement, the frequency of avulsions and the spatial patterns of avulsions has changed quite dramatically. So historically, avulsions had only occurred once every 3,000 to 6,000 years. Less than 200 years after colonial settlement in the valley, we've had a avulsion completed, and in an area of wetlands where historically they hadn't occurred. Now, this is a picture taken around the turn of the new millennium, so it's probably about 25 years old. This aerial slide that showed where the head cuts were, and at that time there was serious concerns that they were going to connect up with the Clip River and drain the parts of the wetlands where rare bird species such as the wattled crane and the crowned crane were breeding. So there was a serious threat to the Ramsar state of this wetland. It hasn't quite transpired as yet, at least. The breeding grounds have been irreversibly damaged, but it's an ongoing concern. So in the Clip River wetlands, what are the management options? This was something Spike McCarthy, myself and others pondered over 10 years ago, and we wrote up this paper, which was published in Wetlands Ecology and Management. The details are in that paper if you're interested. But essentially the options ranged from do nothing, just let things continue as they're continuing, through to various forms of intervention to try and manage the process of head cut retreat and avulsion. The key point really is that quaternary wetland reconstructions in this case for time periods before significant human influences, provided useful insights to guide those management option decision-making. Our quaternary data, alongside other data, showed which options were feasible and which were not. It helps us to choose between these different alternatives and identify the targets that realistically we could set for wetland restoration or rehabilitation projects. So if we take the option of doing nothing, just letting the avulsion complete, let the meanders develop along the newly formed channel, that could be possible. But given the very slow rates of lateral migration in this setting, you'd be sitting around waiting hundreds, if not thousands of years for a meander belt to re-establish. So essentially, we concluded that some form of ongoing but low maintenance management was needed in this system if we wanted to restore some form of hydrological functioning and but basically maintain the Ramsar status of the wetlands. It was certainly not a case of going back to what was there before. In some respects, this wouldn't even be deemed desirable. So there was an argument that exotic willow trees, which had colonized many sections of the Klip River channel, should be removed. But in fact, these willow trees now provide perching, roosting and nesting sites for bird species that otherwise probably would not have been present in and around the wetlands. So various raptors, egrets and ibis species. But effectively in this system, you need some form of management in perpetuity if you want to restore and maintain some form of hydrological functioning. To use Curtis Richardson's term, it is now a managenous system. Okay, so on to the final part of the talk then, just quickly, the global challenges for science and management of wetlands and drylands. Now, you could group challenges in various ways, but broadly you could put them into scientific, environmental, socio-political, and institutional. Each of these could probably be a talk all by itself, but I'm going to skim through each one, cherry picking a few examples, and perhaps you can ask me questions about the others. So if we start with the scientific challenges, for many people, the term wetlands and drylands is still seen as an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms. How can you have a wetland in a dryland? Hopefully, for those of you that came to this talk unaware of that, you've got a little bit more insight now. But more generally, I think one challenge is simply to raise awareness of wetlands in drylands and the factors that can promote their formation. This is easier than it sounds, actually, though. If we just take the apparently simple issue of wetland inventories, where are the wetlands? What types are the wetlands? How many are there? How much area do they cover? Many wetlands in drylands go under the radar. To return to this slide that I showed earlier, they may be known by a variety of local and regional terms and so not fully recognized as wetlands. Also, they might be missed in mapping exercises, being too small to be mapped from large-scale remote sensing imagery, and/or because they may be ephemeral features, dry for long periods of time, and then only wet or moist for short periods following rainfall or flooding. Another scientific challenge is the need for more quaternary chronology. Hopefully, I've just shown how good OSL chronology can be very useful for evaluating management options in places like the Klip River. Myself and others have been building up chronological data sets for other wetlands globally, including the Okavango River, as shown top left there, and the Macquarie Marshes in Australia, and there's a whole number of other South African wetlands where good chronologies exist as well. The Macquarie River, by the way, is a shrunken, this is the modern Macquarie here, it's a shrunken vestige of what it used to be. You can see these very large paleo channels to the west of the current channel running out across the plain. But we need much more chronology to really be able to answer these sorts of key questions, including what is the ecosystem response to fluvial change and what are the implications for ecosystem service delivery now, but also crucially in future decades as rivers and wetlands continue to adjust with global climate change and human impacts. And if we move on to these environmental impacts, we know that many wetlands and drylands are changing very, very rapidly indeed due to climate change human activities or a toxic combination of these and other factors. So we've got examples from Bolivia and Utah here. We could find many, many more examples. Just one here from Doñana National Park in Spain, southwest Spain. It's a Ramsar site. It's also a World Heritage site, but also at risk of desiccation and creeping human impacts. These worrying trends are tempered by the occasional success story. So there's one here from Mono Lake in California. But these success stories tend to be exceptions to the general trend. But it may be that what I term here, the market share of wetlands and drylands may grow as more humid region wetlands start to behave more like wetlands and drylands with a more variable hydrological and ecological pulse. We move on to the socio-political challenges. Wetlands and drylands research doesn't seem to have the same parity as wetlands in humid regions research. Now, this is despite the fact that within the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which had a whole section devoted to wetlands, there was actually recognition that wetlands in drylands, such as oases, rivers and marshes, as they say here, are disproportionately important in terms of the biodiversity that they support and the ecosystem services they provide. This is because wetlands in a dryland are often the only semi-reliable sources of surface water. And there was one box where they expanded on this point a little bit more, but that's about as far as it's gone. There's little detail, and work by the MEA or cognate groupings has not really kicked on in the last 20 years or so. So for wetlands and drylands, we don't have answer to the sorts of key questions here. We know that ecosystem services impact on human well-being in all sorts of weird and wonderful ways. And there's this tangle of arrows here in the center. But we don't really know well how the distinctive characteristics of wetlands and drylands, their variable hydrological pulsing, for instance, impact on ecosystem service delivery. And we don't really know in detail how the intensity and direction of linkages varies between these services and human well-being. We also have critical data gaps, and particularly in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this is an example from Don Kurtzer and colleagues' work in South Africa, where they looked at different types of wetlands, as they term them, the wetland hydrogeomorphic units down the side here, and they looked at regulatory benefits potentially provided by the wetland in terms of flood attenuation, stream flow regulation, and enhancement of water quality. And they looked at a whole series of factors. Interestingly, they decided not to look at carbon trapping in these wetlands. Everyone assumes that wetlands, of course, are major carbon stores. But is this necessarily the case in a wetland in a dryland where you have periodic desiccation and indeed fire burning off the organic stores, potentially burning off the organic stores? Kurtzer et al. Concluded that there just wasn't the data there to try and even attempt to do that. Myself and colleagues have been looking at this. And it may be that organic carbon storage in wetlands and drylands is not particularly high, but carbon may be stored in inorganic forms as carbonates. So actually could potentially prove to be a very large soil carbon store. But watch this space. Finally, the institutional challenges. My question is, are there enough of us globally doing the right kind of things in the right kind of places to generate cascades of information from science to policy to management? Are there enough postgrad students cascading into and through the academic system to ensure a healthy avalanche of data and concepts that can be applied in management practices? Are we, as geomorphologists, able to work in multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary ways with other researchers in other fields? Obviously, there's different models of collaboration that can exist. In many cases, researchers are working in parallel on wetlands, as shown here by Model B. Or there's one dominant perspective, maybe some feeder perspectives from other disciplines. This perhaps is wetland ecology with a little bit of feed in from geomorphology and policy and practice and social science. Really, we need to try and find truly interdisciplinary ways of working where different disciplines converge on a shared concept, and then perhaps spin out to their different audiences to take things further. So those are four sets of challenges, and really these can intersect these scientific, environmental, socio-political, and institutional challenges. I'm just going to use the case of Ramsar World Wetlands Day 2023 to illustrate this. So that's the answer to one of the questions I posed at the beginning. The World Wetlands Day this year was held on 2nd of February 2023. It's actually on the beginning of February each and every year. This year, the theme was wetland restoration. No doubt partly informed by the United Nations International Decade of Ecological Restoration, which is now in full swing. Now, I asked at the start whether any of you were aware of this. Perhaps you can put your answers into the Q&A box. But amongst the otherwise excellent promotional documentation and educational resources associated with this International Day, is there any mention of geomorphology or potential geomorphological contributions? I work on wetlands. This World Wetlands Day often bypasses me, and I've certainly searched through for any mention of geomorphology, explicit or implicit, in the documentation, and I can't find any. Surely, for all of the reasons that I've outlined, wetland geomorphologists should be part of the conversation. What are we trying to restore wetlands to? What should human-impacted wetlands look like? What ecosystem services are we trying to prioritize? How can geomorphological data and concepts inform these conversations? In other words, what is the role of geomorphology in conversations about conservation and in conversations about restoration? Anyway, a few final slides, just to end on the positive note that I promised. In South Africa, some very positive developments have been taking place over the last few decades. So we have various pioneering partnerships to ensure wetland ecosystem service delivery. The World Wildlife Fund Mondi Wetlands Program has been going for more than 25 years now. It's probably 30 years plus. And that's done some really good things, including catalyzing programs for social uplift. The example of Working for Wetlands, for instance, which takes underemployed, disadvantaged, principally rural peoples and teaches them life skills and puts them to work in restoring wetlands. Now, I'm not going to pretend this has been a perfect program. It is not. They've perhaps been doing some wrong things in some of the wrong wetlands, but they've also been doing some good wetland restoration projects around South Africa and teaching people those life skills and getting them and the local communities involved in wetland restoration projects. And there's the National Wetlands Indaba in South Africa, which is a yearly forum for encouraging and facilitating science and practice. The 25th anniversary was in 2021, so we're into the 27th year now of this Wetlands Indaba. And it's an attempt to broaden participation in wetlands research, policy and practice. It styles itself as a community of practice. It's a recognition that wetlands are lived in and worked in landscapes, and you need the support of local communities if wetland management and restoration is to be successful. We also have the Wetlands in Drylands Research Network that Risa mentioned at the beginning. This was set up at the end of 2014 by a number of us. We have a website. It's down on the lower left there. Please go and have a look for that if you're interested. You don't need the www in front, just wetlandsindrylands.net will take you there. And on that website, you'll find a whole series of free downloadable resources, including the Paris Declaration on the Importance of Wetlands in Drylands and a nice colour booklet, 10 reasons why the geomorphology of wetlands is important, plus many, many other things as well. So, global challenges can be defined in various ways, and in a putative Anthropocene, there are many global challenges facing wetlands in drylands in a physical sense, and wetlands in dryland research in a socio-political and institutional sense. But wetlands and drylands can also contribute to the tackling of global challenges, including through restoration efforts to enhance ecosystem service delivery. But we need, I think, to sell this message better. So finally, back to the subtitle of the talk, Wither Science and Management. It's up to us as a community of wetland geomorphologists working in collaboration with other scientists, managers, and local communities around the world to decide where wetland science and management is going. It is definitely not a case, I would argue, of withering science and management. But to prevent loss of vitality, force, and freshness, to keep the sap rising, as it were, so that our science and management continues to be of benefit for society, we need to continually contemplate such questions, taking into account the multiple uses and perspectives on wetlands. So thank you for your time and listening to this presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Todd. It was such a really wonderful and very informative talk. Risa?
Michelle, yeah, I'm having, okay, I was having some issues with my video. Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Tooth, for an outstanding talk, and you touched on topics that we don't really hear enough about. I'd like to get into the questions, so we make sure everybody has a chance. Let's see, I remember the first question was Sarah Rathburn. Let me try and, what happened to Sarah's question? Oh, there she is, okay.
I can see it.
Okay. Sarah Rathburn from Colorado State University asked, did the activities of the native hippos in South Africa support wetland processes, such as creating paths within the floodplain that distributed the flow? And similar to how beaver channels throughout wetlands in more temperate regions fostered channel floodplain connectivity?
Short answer to that is yes. It was first fully documented, I think, in the Okavango Delta by Spike McCarthy, Fred Ellery, and others, and they looked at the activity of hippos in creating trails through the areas of reed swamp, and these trails can provide avulsion pathways. So they breach the vegetated lined channel banks in the delta and encourage flow diversion, and the hippo pathways get widened out by the flow, and that can ultimately lead to avulsion. We then noticed it in places like the Clip River wetlands, because I didn't say this during the talk, but they actually did start to reintroduce hippo in the first decade of the new millennium. They were a little bit hemmed in. They weren't allowed to freely migrate as they would have done historically, but they were certainly creating all kinds of trails through areas of reed swamp and floodplain, and they can certainly act as avulsion pathways. But you know, these systems would have, if you take the hippos out, they still avulse. So I suppose the hippos, and indeed other large mammals like elephants, can create avulsion pathways, but it's an embellishment on a naturally occurring process.
Okay, thank you. Michelle?
Yeah, thank you very much. We also have a question from Greg Pasternak. So he said that his PhD dissertation was on wetland geomorphology, and he noted that at the time a dearth of geomorphologists being interested in publishing on the topic. So they were like a small community on its own. And today, 25 years later, the same looks about the same. How much of the problem is just a question of how research money is sourced versus maybe the culture of geomorphology focusing on mountains and rivers, or something else maybe? What is your opinion about that, Professor?
Yeah, I'd like to talk to Greg more about that at some point. Yeah, things haven't moved on. Look, probably my answer to that is wetlands are these sort of liminal spaces, aren't they? They're not fully terrestrial and they're not fully aquatic. They sort of sit halfway between, and I think it's, you know, they're difficult to typify, they're difficult to classify, they're difficult to map, and that probably makes some geomorphologists feel a bit uncomfortable. You know, and wetlands research has tended to be dominated by ecologists, and there still, I think, is relatively limited interaction really between ecology and geomorphology. I mean, okay, you've got the field of biogeomorphology, zoo geomorphology, which has been growing, but it's small relative to the number of ecologists and indeed the number of geomorphologists. So I think there's a couple of reasons. You know, geomorphologists have tended to ignore wetlands, and wetland specialists have tended to ignore those few geomorphologists dabbling in wetlands. So it is partly a cultural question. Whether it's necessarily a research money issue, I don't know, but I'm happy to talk to Greg about that at greater length at some point.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, I guess this is a similar question from Matt Rowberry. How do you begin the process of collaborating with other disciplines when they don't fully appreciate what you're able to bring to the table?
Yeah, it's
like, how do you, I mean, did you have any proposals of?
Well, I've tried, you know,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know Matt from times back. Hi, Matt. I've tried, Matt knows I've tried. He's probably tried trying to raise the profile of geomorphology in various circles. I've been to, you know, the Eco Summit Symposia in Ohio in 2012 to talk about wetland geomorphology, basically a conference full of ecologists, and people listened politely and said, that's interesting. And like a lot of us, you know, you come back all enthused and full of ideas, and you get back to your office and you just get on with what you did before. So it is difficult. It's a slow burner, I think. And I think it's getting increasingly difficult, though, because despite all the talk about the need for interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary research and the growth of a number of journals that are supposed to try and encourage that, the reality is that most people end up publishing to their own audiences that they're comfortable with. You know, so geomorphologists write for geomorphologists and ecologists write for ecologists. And the few times you do try and go interdisciplinary, you just open up a whole world of grief for yourself. You know, I've done various interdisciplinary things, not just in wetlands, but in art and geomorphology, and it can be really, really hard work writing for different audiences. So by default, I think myself and others fall back into what we're most comfortable with.
Just to add to that, I'm not seeing more questions, but I guess would it help to put it under like critical zone science? Because it sort of is part of that, and it seems to do really well, somewhat, in addressing, you know, the sort of collaboratory issues you're experiencing.
Well, maybe critical zone science, funnily enough, is a very much a US thing. I don't think it's really caught on in. Certainly not in Britain. I don't know about Europe. It's a term that I've not really used. I mean, 15 years ago, we were all talking about Earth system science, and there was a British Society for Geomorphology annual meeting called Geomorphology and Earth System Science, and I gave a talk actually on wetlands at that meeting, making the point that wetlands are like Earth system science in microcosm. You know, they're interactions. They form as a result of interactions between the atmosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere, geosphere, and so on. I mean, you could probably just change the term ESS and put critical zone in there, and you'd have more or less the same talk. Funnily enough, I never published that paper up, but yeah, maybe you guys that do work in critical zone science, you've established those interdisciplinary collaborations a little bit better than the rest of us have been able to do. And maybe that is a wedge that could be driven in.
Well, I'd like to see it go more global. So I don't know, maybe there's an opportunity there. I guess I'm not, are you seeing more questions, Michelle?
Yeah, I did not see
Okay, all right,
more comments regarding what we were talking about there.
I'll go, yeah, there's a lot more down here. Like Suzanne, did you want to get Suzanne Walters at the bottom?
Yeah, she's commenting about like the previous question, like.
Oh, okay. Okay, yeah. Let's see. A sea level, Sonam. It's your question?
Yeah,
Michelle?
I can. Oh,
okay.
Well, I can read it if you.
Okay,
so,
go ahead.
Susan Walter was mentioning that when you go that transition to a new place, right? Sometimes it's tough to meet people in other subfields if you don't overlap conferences. And she, in particular, Susan, is like very newly in coastal region. where every stream flows into a wetland story, and would love to find collaborators, but everyone here is an ecologist focused on biofilm. So that's what she mentioned.
Okay.
Yeah, well, yeah.
oh,
I mean,
okay.
I can empathise with Susanna there. That, like I said, I've been to ecology conferences. You know, trying to fly the flag for geomorphology, if you like, and it's like wading through treacle, really. I mean, everyone was very polite; they weren't hostile or anything, and I assumed they, you know, recognised what I had to say was moderately interesting. But it's another thing to go another step and establish a collaboration on the back of that. It's quite hard work. I mean, I don't know what career stage you're at, Susanna, but just be persistent. You know, I mean, if you've got a good enough message, just keep saying it in as many different fora as you can. Someone will listen eventually, hopefully.
I did just want to get one more question in here. Sonam from Gandhingar, India. His question is related to the impact of sea level rise on the wetlands. Will the areas of wetlands increase owing to impact of sea level?
Oh, good question.
And I guess the climate change thing, yeah.
Yeah. So I've steered well away from sea level impacted wetlands. I work in wetlands and drylands, which tend to be found in continental interiors far away from sea level. So that takes out one complication. However, there's a caveat to that in that I've just started working in Doñana National Park in southwest Spain, which is a Ramsar listed site with both freshwater and saline wetlands, and it's in a dryland area. And sea level rise is occurring there. And so you've got saltwater ingress into previous areas of freshwater marsh. So I don't know whether it's necessarily that the area of wetlands will increase. It's possible if there's space for them to expand into, but I think in many cases it will be a case of wetlands transitioning from freshwater dominated to more salt impacted, if not dominated. So it might be a change in wetland type rather than necessarily an expansion in wetland area. The other rider to that is that a lot of people are starting to recognize that wetlands can provide a nature-based solution to sea level rise. So in the UK, not a dryland, obviously, but in the UK, there's active creation of wetlands, salt marshes, and so on to sort of buffer the impacts of sea level rise. So it could be that there is proactive management to increase area of wetland as a consequence of potential impacts of sea level rise.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Tooth. I think we've come to the end of the hour, so I'm going to hold. Hello.
Yep.
Hello. Okay, it's my video.
No, it's
so,
mine. I've just stopped.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Michelle, I think Michelle's going to sign us off
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
Before you wrap up, I just have a comment that there is a person called is Dr. Scott Davidson, currently at Plymouth University. So for people on Twitter, they're currently running a wetland cup on Twitter. So they have I don't know, they started with like 32, I think, and they're down to like the round of 16 now. So if you want to check it out, you don't need to be a Twitter user. You can just go and check it out. Dr. Scott Davidson. He's on Twitter as Scoot JD, SCOOT JD. So you can check that out. And we probably ran out of time for questions, but I just wanted to ask, given that we have folks in the audience that also work with journals, if you've ever tried in terms of like organizing a special issue or something that would try to bring together all the different fields, as opposed to trying to go to geomorphology or go to ecology journals, maybe organizing a special issue would try to make that integration or promote it.
Yeah, thank you, thank you very much, Roberto, for that information. And also, yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for attending this really interesting talk. Professor Todd, very, very thankful with you. And also for all those great questions. Also ask to stay posted through email, social media, EPSP Connect's website for information about our upcoming monthly talks. And one more time, thank you everyone for here.
Yeah, let me just say thanks again for the questions, all great. And for those people that just made comments as opposed to questions in the chat, Jean Goddard, Greg Pasternak, Wendy Brewer, and so on, Amy East. Yeah, thanks. Joan Mosso just put a question in as well, so or a comment. So yeah, thanks very much. And yeah, feel free to email me if anyone's got any follow-up questions. I might be out of email contact for a couple of days. I'm actually going to a part of Wales where it's a Wi-Fi dead zone. So,
Well, if you would like to answer the questions, I guess you're free to. I mean, whoever needs to go can go, and you can.
I'll hang on for a few minutes. Yeah, if people want to ask.
Okay.
Something else, but, unless you want to shut things down, but anyway.
Yeah. I'm not sure, Michelle. I mean, I guess you can unmute yourselves if you've asked a question. I'm seeing one from Wendy Brewer.
Yeah.
Um,
I think that how is that how can we do that? Can we just unmute them, Roberto?
Okay.
Perhaps guide us in that.
Yeah, I think I see mostly comments. So Wendy said that as a fisheries biologist, they do seem to be quite engaged with geomorphologists in the stream restoration efforts. And then there are a couple of comments from Amy East, JGR Earth Surface, saying that they would be happy to host a special issue. Someone commented also Journal of Physical Geography could be a good place. I'm here kind of also, I can promote Geomorphica, an upcoming Diamond Open Access journal in geomorphology. So there's plenty of options in the field, and I guess the conversation can continue. There's obviously a couple more established journals mentioned here in the chat, so good options throughout.
Very good. Yeah.
Hey, guess if unless somebody else wants to unmute and ask your question, I think we'll wrap this up. So once again, Dr. Tu, thank you very much. And it was good meeting you.
Okay, and you, and yeah, maybe I'll tune in for some of these future talks.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah. Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.